Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're plunging into a world that's literally everywhere you look, but often goes unnoticed. Typography.
Yeah, it's all around us.
And this isn't just about, picking a pretty font for your document or website. It's really about understanding how and why type works the way it does, how it shapes everything we read.
Our guide for this deep dive is, well, it's a really foundational text.
Yep.
Excerpts from Thinking with Type,
Hmm.
the second revised and expanded edition by Lupton. It's a fantastic book that peels back the layers on this essential craft.
Exactly. And our mission today is to pull out the most important nuggets of knowledge and maybe some surprising insights from this source specifically for you. We want to unpack the history, the core principles, the practical stuff,
Practical applications, yeah.
showing how typography gives language physical form, how it shapes content, and it enables the flow of messages in ways you might not have even considered.
And right from the start, the book sets this really interesting stage. It says, look, this isn't a book about fonts as just static objects. It's about how to use them. Typography is presented as this powerful tool for doing things with content, shaping it, giving language that actual physical body, and enabling communication on, well, pretty much every level.
Okay, so let's unpack that. Let's start right at the beginning. Where do these letter forms we use every day even come from? The source mentions words originating as gestures of the body.
It's a fascinating thought, isn't it? Connecting written language right back to physical movement, to the hand. And the earliest typefaces, they directly reflect this. They were modeled on calligraphy, on the actual work of a hand holding a pen or a brush.
Which brings us to, well, a really pivotal moment, certainly in the West. Johannes Gutenberg. His invention of movable type in Germany, early 15th century, that was absolutely revolutionary.
Oh, completely. It allowed for something totally new, mass production of the written word. I mean, compare that to hand-scribing every single book.
It's hard to even imagine.
And a key insight here from the source is that the Latin alphabet, with its relatively small character set, was really well suited for this kind of mechanization. Much more so than, say, complex systems like Chinese writing with thousands of characters.
That makes sense.
But what's really surprising, even with this groundbreaking tech, Gutenberg's famous Bible was designed specifically to look like a handmade manuscript.
He was trying to copy the old way.
Exactly. He went to incredible lengths, creating multiple versions of each letter, using tons of ligatures, those combined characters like phi or fel, all, to reproduce these slightly irregular, sort of organic texture of the black letter handwriting common then.
So right there, at the birth of mechanical type, you already see this tension the source talks about, this ongoing push and pull throughout typography's history between the hand and the machine.
Precisely. Between the organic and the geometric, the human body and the abstract system. That tension is really fundamental if you want to understand how type evolved.
Look at the Renaissance, for instance. There was this conscious connection being made to the human body.
Yeah, Geoffrey Torrey, back in 1529, he published these diagrams explicitly lighting the anatomy of letters. The ascenders, descenders, the curves directly to the anatomy of man.
Wow. But then things shifted, didn't they? Reflecting broader cultural movements like the Enlightenment.
Exactly. The Enlightenment brought this huge focus on abstraction, on science, on rationality.
And that showed up in type design.
It did. In 1693, under Louis IV in France, a whole committee was formed to design Roman letters using a fine grid. This became known as the Romain du Roi, the king's alphabet.
And it's interesting who was on that committee.
Right. Not primarily typographers. It was two priests, an accountant, and an engineer. Their approach was very scientific, almost mathematical, and you see that reflected in the engraved forms they produced.
Engraving. That seems like it offered a different kind of artistic freedom compared to the fixed blocks of metal type.
It definitely did. Engraved lines could be much more fluid, much less constrained by the rigid mechanical grid of letterpress. And these engraved reproductions were actually crucial in spreading the popular styles of the great 18th century writing masters, like George Bickham in his book, The Universal Penman.
And that directly influenced printers.
Oh, absolutely. Figures like William Caslon in the 1720s, John Baskerville in the 1750s, they adopted styles that mimicked the look of the flexible steel pen or the pointed quill instruments that naturally produced that beautiful thick and thin line variation.
Baskerville, he was a real innovator, wasn't he?
He really was. His typefaces were so sharp, the contrast between the thick and thin strokes was so high that some people at the time were genuinely unsettled by them.
Unsettle? How so?
Well, they actually accused him of blinding all the readers in the nation.
Blinding them. That's incredible. It really puts into perspective how radical his style must have felt.
It does. He was obsessive about detail, too. Made his own incredibly black ink, even hot-pressed his pages after printing to get this super crisp result. You can see that sharpness in examples like his 1757 Virgil page. The source points out the very upright forms, the strong contrast, and how he used different styles together on one page. The main Roman text, italic capitals, small capitals, and those charming old-style numerals that dip below the baseline.
And then, at the turn of the 19th century, things got pushed even further.
Right. Bodoni in Italy and Didot in France, they took Baskerville's style and pushed it to an extreme. Their typefaces had an almost purely vertical stress, even sharper contrast, and these thin, really geometric serifs.
How was that received?
Some saw it as a total break from the past, completely unhinged from calligraphy.
Yeah.
Some even called this new style a monster because it felt so abstract, so removed from the human hand, almost dehumanized.
Okay, and here's where it gets really interesting, because this evolution connects directly to these bigger societal shifts, right? The 19th century industrialization, mass consumption.
Exactly. And that created this huge demand for bold, eye-catching advertising typefaces. Typefaces that basically screamed for attention.
So the classical letter forms became raw material.
Pretty much. They were suddenly being embellished, engorged, twisted in every way imaginable. You start seeing expanded letters, contracted ones, shadowed, inlined, fattened, faceted, even floriated letters. Serifs weren't just these subtle finishing strokes anymore. They became these independent structural things.
You can see that really vividly in examples the source mentions, like the Duria's imported cornstarch lithograph or the full moon poster from the 1870s. Just multiple fonts crammed together, really fighting for your attention.
Yeah, the full moon poster is even described as looking as static and conventional as a tombstone. It was just a lot.
It led Walter Benjamin to famously describe that visual landscape as being overrun by locust swarms of print.
That captures it perfectly, just this overwhelming visual noise.
And then, of course, the 20th century brought new responses. You had the avant-garde challenging all the traditional forms, and later the Swiss designers trying to rationalize everything with the grid.
Which kind of brings us closer to the present day, to contemporary typefaces. Many still draw inspiration from tradition. You look at faces like Quadrat or Scala. They look back to the 16th century but feel modern.
But others come from totally new sources.
Right, like Gotham, which was derived from lettering on New York City's Port Authority signs. And it gained huge visibility, of course, being used in the Obama campaign.
So when we choose a typeface today, we're really tapping into this incredibly rich, complex history. It's not just, oh, that looks nice.
Not at all. And the source gives us a basic classification to help navigate it. Humanist, transitional, modern, which loosely mirror the Renaissance, Baroque, and Enlightenment periods in art. And even sans serifs aren't all the same. You've got transitional or anonymous ones like Helvetica versus the more geometric ones like Futura.
So knowing this history is key.
The key insight really is that selecting type with, as the book says, wit and wisdom, requires understanding this evolution and the ideas that are sort of embedded in these different forms.
That framework definitely helps make sense of it all. Okay, moving beyond the individual letter forms, let's talk about shaping larger blocks of text, about layout. The source describes text not just as words, but as a field or maybe a texture.
Yeah, a texture with properties like grain, color, density, all things that are infinitely adjustable by the designer.
And the technology we use fundamentally shapes that space, right?
Absolutely. Think about the difference between the solid, fixed blocks of metal type and the fluid, sometimes unpredictable nature of digital media. Text has evolved from being this stable body on a page to something more like an adaptable, fluid ecology.
So how do we organize all these individual letters and styles into something coherent? That's where font families come in, I guess.
Exactly. The Roman form is usually the foundation, the core. Italic, which is based on cursive handwriting, started being paired with Roman back in the 16th century. And these pairs were really formalized into what we think of as font families in the early 20th century.
And within those families, you get special characters and styles, like small caps. They're a classic example.
Right. Small caps are specifically designed to integrate smoothly into a line of text. They're typically a bit taller than the lowercase x height, but they don't have the tall ascenders of full caps, so they create this distinct visual rhythm without shouting.
But there's a crucial point the source makes about them.
Yes, the difference between true small caps and false small caps, or as the source calls them, pseudo small caps.
And those false ones are bad news.
Very bad news. They're described as just shrunken full-size caps that end up looking puny and starved.
Yeah.
It's definitely labeled a type crime, even an abomination against nature.
Strong words.
They are. You absolutely want to use the true small caps, the ones designed specifically for that size within the font family. Thankfully, OpenType fonts often include these automatically, making it much easier to avoid that particular crime.
And speaking of capitals, the source isn't keen on using all SOCAP PS for running text either. Calls it bulky, insane.
Yeah, it significantly reduces legibility in long blocks of text. It just creates this dense, hard-to-read rectangle. If you need a line of emphasis that doesn't have tall ascenders or descenders messing with the line spacing, using all true small caps creates a much cleaner, more readable line.
And bold versions? They came later.
Primarily a 20th century edition, yeah, mainly for emphasis, and they feel like a natural fit for sans serif families, which often offer this whole spectrum of weights from light to black. But historically, traditional serif families like, say, Garamond, they just didn't have bold counterparts. It wasn't part of their original conception.
The digital world obviously brought a whole new era of font formats and file types too.
Oh, definitely. We started with things like PostScript Type 1, which was a bit clunky. You had separate files for the screen and the printer. Then TrueType came along, simplifying things with a single file.
But OpenType was the real game changer.
Absolutely. Developed by Adobe and Microsoft, it's cross-platform, it's a single file, and it can hold a massive character set, potentially up to 65,000 glyphs. This is where you get all those goodies. True small caps, ligatures, alternate characters, extensive language support, often found in fonts labeled Pro.
And there's a nerd alert mentioned if you want to really dig into what these fonts offer.
For sure. You can access specific OpenType features through menus in your layout software, or you can use the glyphs palette to actually see every single character the font designer included. You might find surprising swashes, alternative figures, ornaments hidden away in there.
What about all the free fonts you find online? They're everywhere now.
The source takes a pretty pragmatic view here. It acknowledges that, yeah, a lot of free fonts online are poor quality, they might have incomplete character sets, or sometimes they're even stolen or pirated.
But it's not all bad.
Not at all. Many talented creators freely give away high-quality fonts. Some are distributed specifically for underserved communities or language groups. And you have the whole open source movement, particularly with the Open Font License, OFL, which allows for free use and even modification.
So it's a balance.
Exactly. The insight is that while supporting the design ecology often means paying for professional fonts, the availability of these willingly shared resources also genuinely enriches the world. It's not just black and white.
Okay, let's zoom in even further, down to the micro details like punctuation. The source says even the design of something like a comma matters.
It really does. The shape of a comma, its weight, its curve, it reflects the very essence of the typeface it belongs to. Think about the difference between a chunky, geometric Helvetica comma and a more flowing, almost calligraphic Bodoni comma. They feel totally different.
So you need to know your typography and your grammar.
Both are essential for clear communication.
Yeah.
And there's one specific punctuation error that gets called out as a pandemic error.
Ah, yes, the quote marks.
Using those straight prime or hatch marks, what people often call dumb quotes, instead of the proper apostrophes and quotation marks, the curly quotes or smart quotes. This is a classic type crime.
Why is it so bad?
Because proper typography understands that double and single quotes aren't just one generic mark. They have 4 distinct forms depending on whether they are opening or closing a quote. Getting these right requires either specific keystrokes or using the smart features in your software. The source notes that designers often spend time manually purging these dumb quotes from client manuscripts.
Are there other common punctuation type crimes we should watch out for?
Several are listed. Using a hyphen between numbers when you should use an end dash, the end dash is slightly longer and signifies a range.
Oh.
Putting 2 spaces after a sentence, that's a relic from monospace typewriters, totally unnecessary now. Using 2 hyphens to try and make an M dash again, use the actual M dash character. And using an end dash within a compound word where a hyphen belongs.
So many little details.
But paying attention to them really does improve the look and professionalism of your text significantly.
Okay, so you've got your carefully chosen typeface, you've fixed all the punctuation crimes, but getting the text itself ready often involves an editorial process, right? The source outlines this, which designers often end up inheriting.
That's right. It usually happens in phases. There's developmental editing, which looks at the big picture, the structure. Then there's copy editing, sometimes called line editing or manuscript editing, which is about refining the language, checking grammar, ensuring consistency, correcting errors. And finally, proofreading, which is that last check on the design pages before they go to print or go live.
And the source emphasizes the value of a neutral editor.
Definitely. Someone who isn't the author or the designer can often catch things that those closer to the project might miss. It quotes the Chicago Manual of Style on manuscript editing.
And errors caught at different stages have different consequences, particularly cost-wise.
This is a really key practical insight. You have printer's errors, PEs, which are the printer's fault, pretty rare now with digital workflows. More common are author's alterations, AAs.
The author changes their mind.
Exactly. Changes requested by the author or client after the text has supposedly been finalized and approved. These can be costly in terms of time and money, and the client usually pays for those. Then there are editor's alterations, EAs, mistakes the editor missed, and their employer typically covers the cost.
And late changes are the worst.
Especially changes made after printer's proofs are generated. They're the most expensive and cause the biggest project delays, hence the famous, ominous last words in publishing.
We'll catch it in the blue line.
Precisely. Famous last words indeed.
The source also mentions editing soft copy, like using track changes or redlining, which is common now.
It's efficient for showing changes. Clearly, you see the strikeouts, the highlights. But there's a significant risk. If those editing traces, the markups, aren't scrupulously removed before the file goes for final design or typesetting, you can end up with disaster. Words jammed together, embarrassing comments accidentally appearing in the final printed piece.
Yikes, okay. And proofreading itself involves a whole set of specific symbols.
Yeah, there's a standardized set of marks that proofreaders use in the margins and within the text to indicate specific corrections. Things like STET, which means let it stand if you decide not to make a change that was previously marked. The crucial thing is to mark corrections legibly on one master proof and avoid scribbling between the lines of text.
And there are different types of proofs you might encounter along the way.
Typically, yes. Galley proofs show the text usually before it's broken into pages. Page proofs are fully paginated and include images. Revised proofs show corrections from earlier rounds. And printer's proofs are those final ones sent to the printer. Ideally, at this stage, you're only looking for genuine printer's errors, because changes are super expensive here. The source also notes that designers, especially in a studio setting, are often responsible for the actual typesetting themselves.
Okay, so you've wrestled the text into shape, it's edited, proofed, ready to go. Now you need to actually place it on the page or screen. This brings us squarely to the grid. The source calls it the fundamental system for organizing space and information.
It really is. The grid is all about control, about establishing structure. It's a system for arranging content, whether that content is on a physical page, a digital screen, or even an architectural space.
And like typefaces, the grid has its own history and theory behind it.
Absolutely. From the sort of inherent modularity you got with metal letterpress type, where everything fit into physical blocks, to the invisible coordinate systems we use in digital design today, the grid has always been there in some form.
And designers have engaged with it differently over time.
Oh, yeah. The avant-garde designers in the early 20th century made a point of explicitly exposing the underlying mechanical grid. Later, the Swiss designers built an entire rational methodology around it, seeing it as a way to create a clear, objective visual order, almost reflecting a desire for a rational social order. The course calls it an inescapable mesh that underlies pretty much every system of writing and reproduction.
There's a great line in the source. Print situates words in space more relentlessly than writing ever did.
That's such a key insight. Think about handwriting. It can be more fluid, it can float a bit on the page. Print, especially traditional print, really locks words into a specific position. Control over that position becomes paramount.
And printed texts tend to look machine-made.
They do. And the default mode of typographic control often aims for this kind of tidy, almost invisible order. Think of perfectly regular lines, justified blocks of text. This can create a visual world of what the source calls cold, non-human facts, which is quite different from the more expressive or sometimes ornamental use of space you might find in handwriting.
A fundamental part of that control is alignment. And each type of alignment has its own character, its own risks.
Exactly. Let's break them down. Justified text that gives you those even left and right edges, creating a neat rectangular shape. It's very space efficient, which is why it's the standard for most books and newspapers. The big risk.
Ugly gaps.
Ugly gaps between words, especially if the line length is too short relative to the type size. Hyphenation helps mitigate that, but it can still be tricky.
Okay, then there's flush left, ragged right.
Right, so a hard, straight left edge, but a soft, uneven right edge. Many designers prefer this because it respects the organic flow of language. The word spacing remains consistent. It avoids those awkward gaps you can get in justified text, but the challenge is managing the rag.
The shape of that uneven edge.
Exactly. You need to put in some effort to make it look naturally uneven, not jarringly stepped or forming weird shapes. A bad rag can be really distracting.
What about flush right, ragged left?
The opposite. Hard right edge, soft left edge. This is much less common for long passages of text. It can create a kind of visual tension, almost a repulsion between the text block and other elements on the page. And a specific type crime here is letting punctuation marks at the ends of lines sort of hang out in space, making the ragged edge look even more broken. The source says it looks like it's eating the edge.
And finally, centered text.
Traditionally used for more formal things, title pages, invitations, sometimes poetry, has a very classical feel. The main type crime with center text is just letting it form awkward, clunky shapes. You really need to carefully break the lines into meaningful phrases of varying lengths to make it look elegant.
Of course, you also see designers intentionally playing with these rules, right? Pushing alignment, breaking the grid.
Oh, definitely. Those kinds of layout experiments often highlight the underlying rules by deliberately breaking them. They explore the possibilities of typographic space.
Speaking of visual arrangement, the source specifically calls out stacked lowercase letters as a type crime.
Yeah, lowercase letters just aren't designed to sit neatly on top of each other. They tend to look awkward and illegible.
But stacked capitals can work. We see them on street signs, for instance.
Yes, stacked caps tend to work better, especially if the typeface has wide characters or squarish forms designed for that purpose. Often, those examples involve hand-drawn lettering or specific vertical alignment features within a font. The takeaway is that vertical stacking has different requirements than horizontal setting.
Paragraphs are another key way we structure text on the page, obviously.
They're essentially literary conventions, ways to break up content into more manageable, more appetizing portions for the reader, as the source puts it. Not necessarily natural units of thought, but organizational tools.
And the standard ways to signal a new paragraph are
an indent, traditionally about an M space that's a space as wide as the typeface's point size, or adding extra space between the paragraphs.
And there's a nerd alert about doing that paragraph spacing properly.
Right. For precise and consistent spacing, you should use the space after paragraph feature in your layout software, rather than just hitting the Enter key multiple times, which is imprecise. Also, a common mistake is indenting the very first line of text in a document, or the first line after a subhead. The indent's job is to signal a break, so you don't need it when there's already a clear break.
Good tip. And understanding the difference between a line break and a paragraph return.
Crucial. A soft line break, usually Shift plus Enter, just moves the cursor to the next line without starting a new paragraph, useful for things like lines of poetry or addresses. Hard paragraph return actually ends the current paragraph and starts a new one, triggering any paragraph spacing or first line indent rules you've set up.
Line spacing, or leading, is another vital control for readability.
Absolutely. Leading is the distance between the baselines of consecutive lines of text. The term comes from the strips of lead metal printers used to insert between lines of type.
And there's a default.
Yeah, the software default is usually around 120% of the type size, so 12-point type might have 14.4 points of leading. But adjusting leading is a key design decision. It directly affects the text's typographic color, how dense or light the block looks. Too tight, and your ascenders and descenders might crash into each other. Too loose, and the lines can feel disconnected, like separate elements rather than a cohesive texture.
And then we have tracking and kerning, which control the horizontal spacing.
Right. Tracking is adjusting the overall space between letters across a whole block of text. You might track headlines or blocks of all caps a bit loosely for a more formal, airy, or regal look. Kerning, on the other hand, is adjusting the space between specific pairs of letters that naturally create awkward gaps because of their shapes, like WA, 2, or AV.
And there's a type crime associated with tracking.
Yes, loosely tracking lowercase letters. Lowercase forms are generally designed to fit closely together, and adding too much space between them tends to make the text look disjointed and harder to read. It's generally considered awkward.
There's even a tool for manually nudging individual characters up or down.
Baseline shift. It's useful for fine-tuning. Maybe you need to manually align a superscript or subscript, or perhaps align characters of different sizes or styles within a complex headline or logo. It gives you that precise vertical control.
So all these individual controls, size, weight, leading, alignment, spacing, they all build up to create typographic hierarchy.
Exactly. Hierarchy is how you use all those variables to express the organization of the content visually. You guide the reader's eye, showing them what's the main title, what's a subhead, what's body text, what's a caption. It makes information scannable and understandable.
And in the digital world, the source really emphasizes the importance of structural hierarchy over just stylistic hierarchy.
This is such a key insight for anyone creating web content or digital documents. It's not enough just to make something look like a heading by making it big and bold. That's stylistic. You need to actually label it by its function in the structure. This is a heading level 1, H1 this is a heading level 2, H2 this is paragraph P.
Why is that so important?
Using proper structural markup, like HTML tags combined with CSS for styling, ensures consistency. But crucially, it's vital for web standards, for search engines, which pay attention to headings to understand content structure, usually only one H1 per page, and perhaps most importantly, for accessibility.
Right, accessibility, where the source says, good typography is heard, not seen.
Exactly. The web was fundamentally designed for universal access. Users who are visually impaired rely on screen readers, which linearize the text they read it out loud in a sequence. If your page structure relies purely on visual cues, like using layout tables for positioning or just making text bigger without semantic tags, the screen reader might read the content in a completely nonsensical order.
So structural hierarchy ensures the code makes sense.
Precisely. It ensures the source code is organized logically, so the screen reader can present the information clearly and navigate it effectively. Techniques like using meaningful alt text for images, providing proper captions, using landmark roles, and offering skip-to-content links are all part of designing for accessibility.
The lighthouse.org example mentioned in the source sounds like a great illustration of this.
It is. It shows how the visual layout that a sighted user sees might be arranged one way, but the underlying source code needs to be ordered logically so that different users, whether sighted, using a screen reader, using keyboard navigation, and search engines, can all access and understand the information effectively. Sometimes the visual order and the source order need careful consideration to serve everyone.
It really drives home that design choices aren't just about how things look. They have a real impact on who can actually access your message and how easily they can understand it.
Absolutely, and you see hierarchy in action everywhere, right? The careful balance of big headlines and smaller teaser text on magazine covers, the clear structure of a table of contents, or even organizing simple information in lists, like that crime blotter example that uses different CSS heading levels, H1, H2, and paragraph styles, class, to structure the data clearly.
So understanding these principles allows you, the listener, to make choices that make your own content, whether it's just a presentation, a report, or a full web page, easier to scan, more enjoyable to read, and ultimately more effective at getting your message across.
Definitely, and empowers you to be a better communicator.
Okay, so we've tracked the history, we've dug into the practical craft of shaping text and space with rules and grids, touched on the digital landscape. But typography clearly goes far beyond the page or screen. It's out there shaping our experiences in the wider world.
Oh, absolutely. Think about branding. Typography plays a huge role. A logo type isn't just a static image. It's often part of a much larger graphic language. Designers use typographic techniques like outlining, layering, framing, custom letter forms to express a brand's personality and values.
The source gives some examples.
Yeah, like the identity for the Utrecht City Theater, which used custom letters that could split apart dynamically. Or El Banco de Uno, a Mexican bank that used a custom font inspired by Mayan forms to connect with its specific cultural context. Or even the way New French Bakery combines multiple type elements. The script logo, the supporting sans serif to create their brand feel.
And sometimes typefaces are designed for really specific, demanding functional needs.
Totally. A great example is the typeface retina, designed by Tobias Furrer-Jones specifically for the Wall Street Journal's financial listings pages. It had to be incredibly legible at tiny sizes, packed into dense tables of numbers.
What made it work?
It featured things like carefully aligned numerals, so columns lined up perfectly, and these clever little notches cut out of the corners called ink traps. Those traps anticipated how ink would spread or bleed slightly when printed small on newsprint, preventing the corners from filling in and keeping the letters sharp. It's pure design solving a very specific technical problem.
And web typography, as you mentioned, has evolved so much from the early days.
Massively. We were initially stuck with just a handful of web-safe fonts faces like Verdana and Georgia, which Matthew Carter actually designed specifically for better readability on screen back then. But now, thanks to technologies like @FontFace, which allows embedding, and third-party font hosting services like Typotech or Adobe Fonts, formerly Typekit, designers can use a vast range of licensed professional fonts online.
Which gives web design much more typographic richness.
Definitely. It's allowed the web to catch up, typographically speaking, with print design in many ways, though screen reading still presents unique challenges and opportunities.
The actual digital forms of letters are interesting too, the whole bitmap versus vector distinction.
Right. Bitmap fonts build letters directly out of pixels on a grid, like little mosaics. Vector fonts use mathematical paths and curves, so they can be scaled perfectly to any size. While most fonts we use today are vector, there are contemporary bitmap fonts, like Lors or Elementor, mentioned in the source, that intentionally embrace and exploit that pixel geometry for a specific aesthetic effect. The source even includes an exercise designing a letter on a grid, just to show how type is fundamentally a system, whether it's built from metal, pixels, or paths.
And typography doesn't just stand alone. It works in concert with images all the time.
Constantly. We see it throughout history. Think of old advertisements like the Hood Sarsaparilla ad, where type and illustration are tightly integrated, or even classic book pages like that Baskerville Virgil, combining text and decorative elements.
The dropped capital is a classic example of text as image, isn't it?
It is. That large initial letter at the start of a paragraph. The New York Times Book Review is famous for using this convention, often treating the dropped cap almost as a separate illustration, commissioning artists just for that letter. Digitally, implementing drop caps can sometimes be tricky. Software often creates a simple rectangular space for the drop cap, which doesn't always interact gracefully with letters that have slopes or curves like an A or V. Designers often have to manually adjust the text wrap or adapt the convention creatively.
The source also includes some humorous takes on our relationship with type, these disorders.
Yeah, the common typographic disorders are quite funny. There's typophilia, defined as an excessive, perhaps unhealthy love of letter shapes, often leading one to die alone.
Ouch.
Then typophobia, a generalized dislike of letters, maybe preferring icons, a state perhaps calmed only by the ubiquity of Helvetica or Times Roman. And my personal favorite, typochondria. Constant anxiety over typeface choice, often paired with OKD, optical kerning disorder. The compulsive need to constantly adjust the kerning between letters by tiny amounts.
Hey, I think maybe a lot of us designers might suffer from a mild case of typochondria and OKD.
Probably, but the source also offers something more practical for getting unstuck creatively. Brain shopping.
What's that about?
It's presented as 30 tips and tricks for generating ideas, ways designers can approach creative problems, including typographic ones. It's not about literal shopping, but about gathering inspiration and shifting perspective.
Can you give some examples?
Sure. Think like a curator, or an anthropologist, or a journalist. Use techniques like creating a word salad or a word map around the problem. Deliberately set constraints for yourself to force creativity. Try to empathize deeply with the user or reader. Rewrite the design problem from a completely different angle. Look for the exact opposite solution. Or try applying thinking processes from totally different fields to the design challenge.
So it's about shaking up your thinking process.
Exactly. It's a great reminder that design, including typography, is fundamentally an act of creative problem solving, not just making things look nice.
And the impact of these core design principles, organizing information, creating functional systems, extends to truly urgent, real-world needs too.
The source makes this connection really well. It references figures like R. Buckminster Fuller, whose Dymaxion House and geodesic domes were based on innovative structural principles like tensegrity. Fuller genuinely believed design could radically improve the human condition. You see similar ideas and concepts for factory-built housing from pioneers like Le Corbusier or Gropius.
And it connects to humanitarian efforts.
Yes, particularly referencing the work of Architecture for Humanity and their book Design, Like You Give Dan. This focuses specifically on architectural and design responses to humanitarian crises, things like developing better emergency shelters.
Like the examples given.
Exactly, like the UNHCR lightweight emergency tents, designed for rapid deployment and specific needs, or even simpler, ingenious inventions like Robert Gillis's grip clips, these little plastic fasteners that allow people to quickly erect temporary shelters using basic sheeting materials. These examples really show how core design principles apply directly to solving critical human problems.
And interestingly, we even see these principles of communication design organizing information, and facilitating social flow playing out in modern political strategy. The source mentions a specific example from Portugal.
Yeah, it describes a Portuguese political campaign that hired Blue State Digital, the same online strategy firm that worked on the Obama campaign. They used Web 2.0 tools, Facebook, Twitter, SMS lists, online forums like their Socrates 2009 site and MyMov social network, specifically to engage voters and party militants.
So it's an example of design enabling communication and organizing.
Exactly. The source presents it factually as an instance of how these digital platforms and communication strategies, often involving careful typographic and layout choices for clarity and impact, are used today to facilitate that social flow and organize people in a political context. It reflects how essential parties now view a sophisticated online presence, even while traditional face-to-face contact remains vital. It's about applying design thinking to political communication.
And finally, the source circles back to how typography and layout are essential for organizing data visually.
Absolutely critical. Think about the examples given. That breakfast cereal chart, which organizes different cereals visually by shape and other characteristics, or the redesigned chart showing the results of an experiment on chloroform and intoxicated ants instead of just lines and numbers. It used variations in tone and dots to make the comparisons between different groups much easier to grasp visually.
So typography isn't just for words.
Not at all. These examples demonstrate powerfully how typography and layout are fundamental tools for making complex data comprehensible, comparable, and meaningful at a glance.
Wow. Okay. We have really gone on quite a journey here. Starting from words maybe beginning as bodily gestures, that constant tension between the hand and the machine.
Through the really practical craft of shaping text, the rules, the grids, the punctuation crimes.
Into the digital realm with its own challenges and possibilities, and then seeing how these principles play out everywhere in branding and accessibility, in solving urgent humanitarian problems, even in politics and data visualization.
It's a vast subject, isn't it?
Yeah.
But that central idea from the source really holds true throughout. Typography is this incredibly powerful tool, not just decoration, but a tool for doing things with content and for connecting with other people.
And hopefully for you, the listener, understanding these elements really does change how you see and interact with the visible word all around you every single day, whether it's in books, on websites, on street signs, or even just in a document or presentation you're putting together yourself.
Start noticing the details, the spacing, the commas, the way a layout guides your eye. You begin to see the intention behind it everywhere.
It makes you realize that pretty much every piece of text you encounter is, in some way, a designed experience.
Indeed. And often, design helps the systems of daily life run smoothly, precisely by letting users and readers ignore how things are put together. But sometimes design should announce itself in order to shed light on the system itself.